you look into this field of really leafy available material for grazing, you do nearly have to visualize it as a field of concentrates or a field of meal. It's really digestible energy, which is good, but you have to introduce it slowly then on that basis.
Hello, I'm Ciaran Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring you latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. In this episode, we're joined by Teagasc advisor James Doran to discuss some of the practicalities of grazing forage crops. We cover key topics such as estimating yield, calculating carrying capacity, and setting up the grazing system, including fencing options, crop allocation, and utilisation. James also shares some advice on introducing animals to forage crops and outlines some important management considerations for ewes and lambs grazing for extended periods. We've seen an early harvest around the country this year. Probably seen a lot more forage crop going in.
Yeah, I mean, you said it there, Ciaran, the early harvest has certainly given people a bit of confidence to go with the crops. I mean, we would always suggest that the later sown crops don't tend to come to the party when it comes to the yield side of things. So, yeah, we had an exceptionally dry spell down here in Wexford in July and early August, which led to those crops coming in that bit quicker. So we had those winter crops were harvested in early July, which meant fodder crops following those are in by kind of mid-July, and then the spring corn, which would be typically harvested maybe around here the 15th, 20th of August, was probably a fortnight earlier as well. So those spring sown crops with the fodder crops following those were all established as well by probably the 15th or 20th of August as well. So it has given everything a massive help in terms of getting into yields. The earlier sown stuff, yeah, yields on that, which were measured there recently on a couple of monitor farms, are hitting about somewhere between 3.5 and 4 tons of dry matter per hectare. So really strong performance and all, really good quality leafy crops as well. So should bode well for performance with lambs.
So look, I suppose the chatting industry was even seed demand this year was way up and sometimes difficult to get. James, I suppose in terms of what's sown, and you mentioned some yields there, hybrid brassicas are probably dominating what's gone in a lot of cases. Are there anything else?
Yeah, there would be, and your listeners might be familiar with trade names like Red Start and Interval or Gorilla. They're all, I suppose, hybrid kale brassicas, which do give you a leg up when it comes to a yield performance. You're getting the benefit of the best of both worlds there, I suppose. Yeah, look, there would be people putting in some cases stubble turnip and fodder rape mixes as well, also needed to comply with other environmental schemes and grazing them then later. But yeah, the standalone hybrid brassicas are still the preferred choice and would be, like I said, hitting the mark when it comes to yield. That's the key benefit to putting those in, really, yeah.
Look, I suppose we're talking about yield, we're talking about grazing them. Sometimes this block might be away from the main block, or the purchase of store lambs, or maybe letting out for store lambs going on. I suppose one of the first things you need to consider, James, is how much crop we have there. In terms of calculating yield and that, it's not a hard thing to do, but there's a couple of just key steps you need to maybe make to get an accurate estimate of what the yield is.
Yeah, so we try and bring everything back, I suppose, to hectares and to some kind of a dry matter basis or establishment. So we chat about measuring quadrants, but I mean, obviously farmers don't have quadrants to hand. So it's as simple as just getting out your measuring tape and put down a metre by a metre in the field and cut out everything that's in that square and weigh it. So what you'll find there is you'll typically get, maybe somewhere around 3 kilos of fresh weight in that metre, 1 metre by 1 metre square in the field. And we multiply that then by 10,000 because we're trying to equate it to a hectare basis. And we tend to work then off of a kind of a 12% dry matter, give or take, on that crop as well. So a simple maths there is if you have 3 kilos in that bag, after you've cut it out from the metre, 1 metre by 1 metre, multiplied by 10,000 is 30,000. And then we multiply that by 12%, which gives you about 3.5 or 3.6 tons of dry matter available then per hectare on that field.
Fairly straightforward thing to do. And I suppose, Jim, you have to put the caveat here, look, well, there's different fields sown. There could be farming urban urine, someone could have got more fertilised than others. Some could be just more naturally fertile. No harm to just maybe take a couple of samples at the beginning and see, well, where is this sitting?
Exactly. You'll find that with fields that maybe are in continuous tillage, or maybe a crop that's following something that has come out of lay. Soil fertility will be different across the board, obviously. So you'll get different responses in different fields. So yeah, it's a brilliant little exercise to do. And within reason, you'll get a pretty good, accurate assessment of what's there. Obviously taking 2 or 3 samples as well if it's bigger fields, just to get a handle on what it is like across, if it's a 20-acre field, for example, what it's like across the whole area. But yeah, really useful thing to do, and you have a great idea of your carrying capacities then from there.
Yeah, look, it's a good step. And you said, look, them crops, despite maybe a wee bit of a setback with them dry conditions in August, did seem to push on and maybe are slightly more leafy this year than other years.
They are, yeah, and those crops that did go in, especially after the winter corn, they started off great. We got hit them with a kind of a mini drought here down in Wexford, where things slowed up for maybe 5 or 6 weeks. We had little or no rainfall, and farmers were kind of worried again because they had taken the opportunity to put the fertilizer on them. But once that rain came, they have really taken off. So, and they're really lush looking now as well. The nitrogen has been retained, or certainly has worked, that was put on as well. So it's brilliant now, and they're getting the reward for going in and taking the chance with it there. Yeah.
So that's one side of the argument, knowing how much we have, and that's the first step. In terms of what we can expect to get from that crop, so I suppose if we think about we have the supply worked out, we look at the demand side. Maybe firstly with lambs, and it's probably the most common one going to go on a lot of these crops. What way do you allocate that? Like in terms of intake, if we've the example you had earlier, that 3.5 ton crop, how many lambs can we expect to carry per hectare? How do we work that out?
Yeah, well, the way this, I suppose, like all these things, you're trying to keep it as simple as possible if we're trying to get this message across to farmers and make it usable in on the ground. So the way I'd look at that is if you have 3.6 tons or 3.5 tons of dry matter per hectare, you're probably looking at a 70% utilization, give or take, depending on weather. Weather is the boss with this crop. If you have good weather, you might get slightly higher than that. If you have bad weather, it'll be a good bit lower. But we work on the basis of around 70%. So that pulls it back then to about 2.7 tons available per hectare of dry matter per hectare. Store lambs, about 1.25 kilos of dry matter per head. That's what they'll eat per day. So look, the way I would always equate that is, and we can make it simple, I suppose, 120 lambs, store lambs, call them 35 kilos or thereabouts, live weight, will generally eat 1 acre of forage rape in a week. That's your kind of ballpark figure. And that's working back, where's that coming from? It's the 1.25 kilos of dry matter divided into your available figure of 2,700, which gives you 18 days per hectare, which is 7 days per acre. I should have mentioned as well, and there's probably lots of people listening to this that are obviously thinking of putting breeding ewes onto this scenario. So the example where I said 120 lambs generally are getting an acre in a week, you're probably looking at 100 odd ewes there, 90 to 100 ewes in an acre for a week as well. And I suppose the other thing to mention there in terms of to visualize the allocation, when we talk about tons of dry matter per hectare, 3.5 tons is the example I'm using. That's something that's probably close enough to your hip height in terms of what's in the field.
So, James, that is a good start point. You've kind of put a figure on what kind of carrying that's important, and you can make your adjustment to how tight to that line you actually want to go to. And I suppose then the other thing is, how long do you want to graze them on it for is probably the other big consideration.
So look, it comes back to your weather again. We would like, I suppose, to think that people want to get as much as they can from the crop and are looking to maybe give breaks or allocations of every 2 or 3 days. In reality, depending on people's work situation and how that factors in, that's not always possible. If it's a 1 week allocation, that's probably as far as we would like to see if seed being allocated at a time, and if you get 2 or 3 days wet weather in that, you are going to walk some of that crop and obviously leave some of that behind you. So weather is the boss. If weather is on your side and there's a fine week in front, yeah, you can give them enough that will do them for 1 week. If the weather is trickier, you're probably looking at kind of 3 to 4 day allocations.
And look, that's something you probably tweak a little bit as you go, using your experience as you get into that crop. Look, we're talking about allocation. Is there any particular advice in terms of how we set up that field? Which side we should graze it from first, James, or the basic setup around fencing it?
Most people will be strip grazing this with electric fence. So what we want there is, if depending on the setup of your field or the size of your field, you want to graze it, I suppose, along the longest side of the paddock or of the field, which is going to make moving the wire that little bit easier, I suppose. So long and narrow is generally better than short and wide, I suppose, when it comes to that scenario. So. And then animals are getting that fresh feed on a much more regular basis, and you're keeping your trampling to a minimum. So that's the idea behind it. And I suppose the other important consideration then to think of there as well is that you do obviously need access to a lie back. So ideally a grass lieback, and the figure there that we would work off is 30%, which would tie in with regulation as well. So, and that, I suppose, the other benefit to having that grass lieback there is that also offers you a fibre source for the sheep as they're grazing the forage crop as well, which is beneficial. So that's important, I suppose, to note there, to have that, I suppose, access to a lieback alongside the crop that you're grazing.
Look, James, many of these are going to be on outdoor blocks, so they are done away maybe from the main grazing area for farms that have sheep as well. That set up like a temporary fence or can work, but I suppose it's important that that's spec'd correctly for what you're trying to divide.
Yeah, so look at anyone that's listening who have sheep will know well that once they start to challenge a wire or a fencer and get through it, they will continue to do that. So you need to have the battery power that's sufficient to drive what you're doing there. So like what we were saying earlier, depending on where the field is split, if you have permanent divisions all around the boundary and you can split across with the wire to maintain as much power in it as possible, that's what you're looking for there. So yeah, make sure the output on your fencer has enough power or enough joules in it to drive because you don't belong gathering up kilometers of wire when you're stripping fields that way, especially if they're awkward or if there's a long run to be put in to break it. Simple thing to do there as well is when you are breaking that field is drive up through it with the tractor wheel or the quad 2 or 3 times just to flatten enough of the crop that you can put in the fence without having it obviously being earthed and which will obviously rob from your power source as well, or power resource. So that's handy as well, rather than going up along with trimmers and things like this. The wheel of the tractor is really effective that way.
Yeah, try and keep it as simple as possible.
Yeah.
So look, we talked a lot there about our yields, setting it up for grazing. In terms of just introducing stock to that, James, any couple of key tips around it, or maybe for longer keep ones, is there anything else we need to consider?
Yeah, well, on the introductions, I suppose, when you look into this field of really leafy, available material for grazing, you do nearly have to visualize it as a field of concentrates or a field of meal. It's really digestible energy, which is good, but you have to introduce it slowly then on that basis. So sheep by their nature, when they're let in for the first day or two, will probably just look at this crop, graze around the fringes, graze what's in the headlands. So you do need to try and train them to grazing this crop. But once they get adjusted to it after day 3 or 4, they will go mad for it. So I suppose that's just to watch, I suppose, in the first instance. While you want to be careful not to introduce it too quickly, sheep generally won't go nuts on it for the first short while anyway. We talk sometimes about having a fibre source available for them. So in some cases, or in a lot of cases, that's probably not required where we have the run back, and sheep are selective grazers, so they will get plenty of fibre from maybe headlands and things like that as well. But if there is a fibre source available, all the better. In terms of what we need to watch out for, which maybe there is one thing there, I suppose, the likes of those fodder crops do contain an instance called goitrogens, which can inhibit the uptake of iodine, basically. So for short keep store lambs, they're probably fine. When I say short keep, 4-6 weeks, that kind of thing, they probably don't need a supplement. But for longer keep store lambs, or obviously for ewes who are going to graze it, they will need an iodine-based mineral supplement, whether that's in the form of a bolus or a mineral bucket or whatever. But it is important that is offered to them, because it can pose issues with fertility in ewes if it's not handled properly. And like I said, it will pose a performance issue with the longer keep lambs as well.
Just another important thing to have set up at the beginning. I'm just thinking, you mentioned weather, probably something else we need to consider. And with the mile back in, it might really be in our heads at the moment. But if you have frosty conditions, James, do we need to change how we time that allocation with them?
Yeah, so we don't want to be grazing these crops when they are frozen, because that can cause digestive upsets as well. So we look, if you wake up in the morning and there's a heavy frost down, just practical stuff. If they're due a break on that crop, we leave them probably until lunchtime or afterwards, until the thaw sets in, and then away we go then again. So we have had issues with lambs on grazing frozen crops over the years, so that's to be avoided if at all possible. Yeah.
I'm kind of looking, I'm thinking here a wee bit more forward towards the tail end of it, and it kind of reflects back the way you started. But if you're finishing lambs on and that crop starts to run out, like supplement will need to be introduced if you're trying to get them stores finished off. You don't want to be in a situation of finish the crop and then have to totally transition. And maybe similar what you always do, like before housing, you'll start to introduce and not leave everything to the last minute.
Yeah, so and exactly, and it comes back to your allocations then, and there's a little bit of, I suppose, trial and error here. While what we say, I suppose, on today's podcast and on book values doesn't always go exactly to plan. So you'll find your feet. If I would say that's 120 lambs for some farmers, it could be 100. For some, it could be 140. So you'll see as you're going along, and then you by virtue of the fact that you're measuring out your breaks in the various different fields, after maybe the first 2 or 3 weeks grazing, how many weeks you have in front of you. And like you said, if that gets you to a shed, brilliant. If it doesn't, well, then that needs to be supplemented with either a fodder source or concentrates to try and slow down the rate of grazing and make sure you're getting there without having to completely change the diet, especially with ewes prior to lambing, which is a big shock to the system, yeah.
Great opportunity for a lot of farmers out there this year, James, and doing some of the basics at the start really does help get the most of that crop.
Yeah, look, it's brilliant, and I suppose, like I always say, the weather is important at all stages with this crop in terms of getting established, and we have that on our side this year, and then in terms of grazing as well and getting the benefit from it. So while it's there now, it'd be great to get a run of weather and get the performance out of it, and a lot of farmers are thankfully set up to go and do that now. So hopefully it all works out.
100%, James. Really appreciate you coming on. Good update.
No problem, Ciaran. Anytime.
We'll leave it there for this week's episode. Some very useful tips from James on getting the most out of that forage crop this season. That's it for me. For updates on the sheep programme, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Ciaran Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe or follow us wherever you get your podcasts.